we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Bob Staudenmeyer. I work with NASA on the ATD-2 team, and I spent, prior to this past 3 or 4 years, I worked at Washington Center for most of 30 years. So what I wanted to go over with you in this briefing, it's kind of like a TMI 101, Traffic Management Initiative 101, how restrictions come about and how they get passed back from place to place. And in our case, how they end up at Charlotte, and Charlotte involved in the restriction process along the way. So the first thing I think I'd like to do is, oh, and by the way, somewhere along the line, we'll certainly open it up for questions, and I'm going to have Brian and maybe Melody help me pass the mic around, because since it is being recorded, it helps if we pass the mic back and forth to whoever has questions. Not to mention, you can pass it through the site also. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. The first thing I like to do, I can show you along the way Charlotte's airspace and how they have 3 parallel runways and an intersecting runway up over here. And then the airspace. But I think what I'd like to do is go to the TBFMP GUI, and I can show it to you a little bit live. So if we could just switch over, and Brian, just turn the lights down a little bit so we can see the map a little bit better. So this is kind of important for how I'm going to show how the restrictions play out here along the way. So I'll be making reference to this along the way here. So if I move my mouse around, I don't know if this is better than the pointer or not, but so here's Charlotte down here. Charlotte is under Atlanta Center's airspace, okay, right down here. And it's about 60 miles from the Washington Center boundary, about 20 miles from Jackson Center boundary, 20 or 30 miles from Jackson Center boundary. And up here is Indianapolis Center, and way up here is New York Center, okay? So a lot of the restrictions that come into play start out of the New York or Washington area and get passed back and eventually end up passed back to Charlotte, Atlanta, Jacksonville Center, things like that. So when there is mile and trail, which is my scenario today, will be mile and trail to LaGuardia. When there's mile and trail, using the TBFM EDC piece of equipment, which is kind of like it's like a subset of TBFM to use mile and trail rather than metering, they're scheduling all off this arc here. So actually I have LaGuardia targets up here. So all these aircraft are all going to LaGuardia. So when a plane gets scheduled off any of the other departure points around Washington Center, Greensboro, Raleigh, Norfolk, and the Washington Metros, and now Charlotte, they all get scheduled in to this point in space, way up here, over 400 miles away from Charlotte. They're getting it scheduled into that point in space based on where all this other traffic will be at that time, up at that point in space. Okay, and I'll be looking for a 15-mile gap or 20-mile gap or whatever Washington Center has set into their TBF system for the mile and trail. Okay, so what's interesting here about Charlotte is, since Charlotte's under Atlanta Center, for years and years and years, when restrictions get passed back, they would say, okay, Atlanta, we need you to help me, because look, we're getting flights from Jacksonville coming up, we're getting flights from Indianapolis cutting across, all going to LaGuardia, and then Atlanta will have a flow coming up this way going to LaGuardia, not to mention into the overhead stream. So restrictions will get passed back to Atlanta Center, and Charlotte would have to fit into the Atlanta Center flow, and Washington, when another center asks for a restriction, they want it by their boundary, entering their airspace. Just like New York TRACON with the LaGuardia Mile and Trail wants it by their boundary, where Washington Center is handing it off to them. Okay, so what would happen over time is Charlotte, of course, busy airport, 6th or 7th busiest in the country, and they have a lot of aircraft heading to those Washington and New York airports. By the way, this is the arc for landing at the Washington Metros if there's mile and trail to National and things like that, okay? That the point in space where they would all try to meet the mile and trail at, and the aircraft we could schedule into. So this was something that an airport that Washington Center really wanted to be able to contact Charlotte directly to schedule right into their flow of flights, rather than having a 30-mile trail here, 30-mile trail here, 30-mile trail in there, and then they all meet up in here anyway and have to get revectored. So if Charlotte was scheduled, when Washington Center is scheduling Charlotte now, they're scheduling it to this point, where when other miles and trail are getting passed back to the other centers, they're scheduling to this point, okay? So hopefully that made some sense. So the other thing that came into play is how are we gonna have Charlotte with the TBFM EDC system for the mile and trail, how are we gonna have it skip over Atlanta Center's arc and get it, because there's other, Atlanta Center has their arcs here up on their boundaries to provide mile and trail to various centers, just like Jacksonville would. So how are we going to get Charlotte to skip over that mile and trail arc and have it recognize the Washington Center mile and trail arc up here on the New York TRACON boundary? And what we used is what ATD-2 used is an existing system, which was T to T, TBFM to TBFM, so it can skip over the arc on the Atlanta-Washington Center boundary out of Charlotte and recognize the point in space up there at the New York TRACON. And that's kind of a very important element, and it was a very important starting point for us for ATD-2 to be able to use this TBFM T to T, TBFM to TBFM, okay? So let's see. I want to mention one last time about the flows. So there'll be a J42 flow that Indianapolis Center provides. There'll be a flow coming from Atlanta Center. And then there's 2 flows from Jacksonville Center, one inland route, comes up over by Raleigh-Durham, and then there'll be another one up over the water route, which we're not going to see planes there today, probably much with the hurricane out there, right? So the inland route's being used a little more often today. So I think that's all I wanted to tell you about that, so we can turn the lights back up if you want, and we can switch back to the PowerPoint. Okay. And there's some of the airspace along the way, and these are the other arcs that I was pointing out, how Atlanta Center has arcs on their boundaries. When Charlotte and their internal traffic has mile and trail of Chicago, they would use this arc because Indianapolis Center passbacks a 30 mile and trail to them. So everybody has these EDC arcs built that aren't on the scopes of the controllers. It's just a point in space trying to hit the mile and trail to, okay, that everybody's getting scheduled into and recognizing the overhead flow. And there again is the one to the Washington Metro, the main one there, and up in here was the one to Newark and LaGuardia, okay? So one of the main tools that the centers use and the main TRACONs use to pass restrictions around is the National Traffic Management Log, okay? And this is kind of one of the things we did with ATD-2 also at the beginning is we didn't go in and ask the traffic management and controllers to change anything to what we needed to make things work. We just let them do their thing and try to gather the data based on how they already operate, see how well we can extract the data whether it's via SWIM or whatever other point. But what we really needed to get the information out of the NTML logs, because that's where the TRACON would pass back restrictions to the center passes restrictions back and forth to one another, and command center uses the NTML logs also, okay? So this is where things are all taking place. This is just a generic photo of the restrictions tab. There's all sorts of different tabs that are used along the way, and then they just kind of fill in the miles and trail. And this one happens to be set up for a mile and trail. They have different drop-down options available to them. Qualifiers, maybe they want the 2 fixes as one, things like that, which airport they want it off of, or if they're requesting it from another center, and the start time and the stop time. That arguably is the most used tab in the NTML, is the restrictions tab, okay? And then, so in our scenario here today, it's in the morning. All my slides won't line up exactly time-wise if you really look into it, but you'll get the gist of it, that how things roughly work in the system. So in my scenario today, it's early morning, the TMU unit's coming in, and New York TRACON realizes they need 15 miles in trail coming in from Washington Center. Now they're not just picking on Washington Center, they're asking in trail from the New York Center folks from their boundary and coming in from Boston Center from the north. So we're just going to go through the scenario about Washington Center, and they requested 15 miles in trail, okay? And then this is just the way it ends up coming out. By the way, Command Center is part of that because they end up having to acknowledge and or approve the restriction along with the other center having to acknowledge it, like Washington Center has to acknowledge that, ends up in the log, or they'll end up having a phone call discussion about it. So Washington Center, what they would do, and tying into 3 Ts, right? So Washington Center would use that TFMS tool, just like New York TRACON probably did to come up with it, and they would look to see where they may need help from. Where's a lot of the volume going to LaGuardia here this morning to pass back a restriction if necessary. So they determined that the flow coming from Atlanta Center, they requested 30 miles in trail coming up Q60 from Atlanta Center, which is that one flow that I showed you that's how the Atlanta Center to LaGuardia would come up through that way. So they requested 30 miles in trail for a few hours. They didn't request anything from Jacksonville, didn't think they needed it at that time, and they didn't request anything from Indianapolis either. So the next thing the TMC did is ran a list out of Washington Center, internally up underneath Washington Center, and said, hey, maybe there's enough aircraft, I need to have the towers call for release or schedule into their IDAC IDST for the facility to have that. They would send out a message through FDIO, Flight Data Input Output, I believe that's the acronym. So they would send a message out basically putting the aircraft on APREC because, yes, they do have enough departure points underneath Washington Center to have them either call or use their IDAC IDST piece of equipment to auto schedule into the overhead flow, okay? And then what happens is Washington Center, notice how in that first map point, Charlotte is not underneath Washington Center, so that FDIO only sends that information to aircraft that belong to Washington Center, that are up, basically underlie Washington Center. So Charlotte would not get that message. If Atlanta Center puts out an FDIO message for APREX, then it would work for Charlotte, but it won't work for Washington Center on the FDIO message. So they have to send a separate message, They have to send a separate message to using the NTML log, and the type is the little phone here, right, for APREC. They've used it, and they put them on APREC for basically all day, over the ones coming over Kilns-Barmy, coming over in their direction. And this is where the ATD-2 system, our engineers started working their magic to try to see how they can ingest this information into ATD-2 and make it a lot less cumbersome, where as I progress here today, the restrictions are going to show up at Charlotte, and how some will show up right into the system, will show up right into the system. And as Isaac mentioned in the last briefing, and you'll hear over time, is how the difficulties along the way, how not everything shows up properly, like the APREC itself shows up late in when it comes in through the NTML log. It ends up in the FAA OIS page. If you just you can look that up online, and you can see all the restrictions that Charlotte has to provide, or somebody else has to provide, or what ground delay programs are currently in effect. That's kind of wide open for people to see. So in this case, yes, they sent it through the NTML message, and now they placed Charlotte on APREC heading towards LaGuardia. And there's what it would look like in the NTML log. And Mike from Charlotte, we're lucky enough to have somebody that works at Charlotte TMU, and he's going to be with me in here in the next briefing. We're going to talk a little bit more about how it's changed his working habits with ATD-2. So anyway, this is how the restriction would show up. He gets it, just APREX over Kilns-Barmy. And then the other thing that would happen back at Washington Center on their ESIS board, Enhanced Status Information System. I know all the acronyms, I just don't know how to letter them all the time. So this is the ESIS board that would be overhead at a lot of centers in the TMU unit, and also in each area on the control room floor at the center. So they would know what restrictions they have to provide, you know, and of course each area, of course TMU is looking at all the restrictions and who's on APREC. It looks like on the day I took this picture, Atlanta, Baltimore, Charlotte, National, Newark, Dulles, JFK, LaGuardia, Palm Beach are on APREC. That's kind of typical. There's usually about 8 or 9 destinations that are on APREC that they have the towers underneath them calling up, you know, each and every time to schedule into that overhead flow, right? So it's really the most used TMI is the APREC, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about that tomorrow in phase 2, about the impact. And so that's the information, so everybody has a view of the overall information. Like, of course, TMU watches everything where the area would just put up, the supervisor in the area would just put up the information that applied to that area. And now, this is where I pointed out that Command Center has a role when that restriction comes across. Again, it's just a generic page here, but when that mile and trail restriction comes across, Command Center needs to approve that restriction as well. And this was a situation that we had to take note of too, is would the restriction come through to the OIS page if the Command Center didn't approve it? And I believe it wouldn't, I can't remember if it comes through yet or not. I'll have to ask Brian tomorrow in the meeting if the OIS page, if the restriction has to get approved by Command Center before it shows up in the OIS page or not. Yeah. So that's, again, the Command Center is using the NTML log as well all the time. And then this is that OIS page I was talking to you about. And I just took this one back in the middle of August was the date. And you can see I just did current restrictions. If you ever get into the FAOS page, you can go under current restrictions and say, what does Charlotte have to provide, or what does Washington Center, what's Washington Center requesting from people? There's different ways of bringing it up. And you can see how they already have, on this particular, they already have National on APREC, Newark on APREC, JFK, and LaGuardia on APREC out of Charlotte, okay? And then some various restrictions that they have passed back to some of the other centers. So now the restrictions have made it back to Charlotte, and like I said, sometimes the APREC would go in place. So let me take a moment here and say that what NASA did with ATD-2 is, remember, one of the main things we're trying to show is how these 3 Ts can all be connected and how they can work together, right? So what NASA did, especially at Washington Center in phase 1, is they plugged it right into Washington Center's IDAC. That's how it came around without any code changes. They plugged it right into Washington Center's IDAC, using that T to T, using these bunch of different systems that existed and some they had to build in order for these APRECs to various places. In this case, National and Philly. I should have had LaGuardia. I should have had a picture of LaGuardia on there, but LaGuardia would show up there also. And non-filled-in lightning bolt is semi-automatic mode, and the center can change these modes around to a filled-in lightning bolt would be automatic mode, or the old-fashioned phone symbol is a call for release. So, and that's how they would. This is a view that quite a few of the TMCs at Charlotte Tower look at. They watch the APREC aircraft, the center view of the map, and then the timeline display. Try to, again, following that 3T process, use the timeline on ATD-2 very similar to how a TBFM timeline is, where it's a countdown. So this is the current time right here. These and time in the past and time in the future. By the way, the gray aircraft are arrivals and the green are departures. And the way they also set it up is runways from left to right. By the way, they look at it upside down for most of us, but it's where the control tower sits, so they're looking out to the south. So down this way is actually north, okay? So it's upside down for, I guess, for some of you. So here's 523, so that's why they'd have planes for 523 over on this part of the timeline, and this is the east runway, 18 left, 36 right. And then the center runway, and then the far west runway, which is all arrivals, okay? So that's roughly how the TBFM set up, as far as the toolbar, which is where we built a TM Actions panel. So Mike or other TMCs at Charlotte, if we couldn't get it ingested into the system, they can always do it manually. They can always put in the mile and trail restrictions or the APREX or whatever the case is on their own as well, okay? And this is just going to be a closer look at each one. Oh, there's my LaGuardia. I know I had a LaGuardia somewhere. So this is that timeline I was telling you about. This is an older picture because 523 is open. So arrivals are coming at 523. And mostly all the parking's here. 523 is closed now, so the east runway becomes departure arrival runway. So basically, so let's keep going on. And there's that map display. They can bring up and look at all sorts of neat things on the map, just like they can on the timeline. But for the most part, they're looking at call signs, where they're going to, and maybe what fix they're going over. Whoa. Sorry about that. Yeah. One more time. Yeah, so they're looking at call sign, type aircraft in this case, and this one's going to Charlottesville, and it's going over the Critter departure fix. Blues are for the east runway. They'll have them color-coded. And there's a few different ways to set this up, but this is, for the most part, the standard way to use it. The browns are for the center runway. So here's the STBO flight table. There's a 1,000,001 columns they could add or delete, and make this longer this way, or add more type of data, or take away more type of data to add more flights this way as well. They choose to watch, for the most part, the aircraft that are on APREC, and they behind the scenes, they can color code them, or they can have them color coded. If Barmy was closed, Barmy can light up as red if it was closed, things like that to alert on. They look at the aircraft type, what gate they're coming from, EOBT. Can't tell you how important this EOBT is for the airlines, for everybody to work on getting this right, especially when we talk more and more about APREX and fitting into that overhead stream. I really want these EOBTs to correct, and I'm going to bring this up the next two briefings as well. And it's really going to be really important under TFDM when we are pre-scheduling the aircraft in advance. You want your EOBT to be correct, so you get that time the first time and don't have to keep rescheduling. And then they'll have this change modes, schedule out is just means they haven't moved yet or anything like that. And then they'll follow the color code of the timeline. Oh, I don't have a good example here in this. Maybe I will later. But we even change the leader lines to various colors depending on where they are. The orange, they haven't even pushed back yet. If they were green, that means they're taxiing around the AMA. If they were a blue color, that means we have radar on them moving around on the ramp. And if they are pink color, that means they push back. Okay. And this is another view of that toolbar. And oh, and by the way, the ramp does have a version, at least at Charlotte, the ramp does have a version of this STBO along with their ramp display as well. So if I'm not in this briefing, the next briefing I'll show you a little bit more of what the ramp looks at too, but they're not able to put in TM actions. Of course, they have just kind of a view only, but this is where the TMCs at Charlotte would create new maps or new timelines, whatever the case is. You know, those timelines that we looked at, you can bring up 1,000,001 timelines if you want to. Just wanted to watch the APREC aircraft, just wanted to watch planes going over certain fixes, all sorts of different ways you can just keep creating maps or timelines or flight tables as well. And it's real easy to bring up their settings and change configurations with the settings. But one of the main things along the way that ramp actually uses more the tower. I mean, the tower TMC pretty much knows the restrictions because he's the one monitoring them coming in and going out. But the ramp doesn't necessarily, so they can look up under the the tab here, and it will unfold all the different restrictions that are going on that are affecting Charlotte. So the ramp has a better idea of what's going on. And then also, we have highlighted here, this is the configuration that the TMC and the tower has put into use in this particular day. And then over here, these tell us if metering is in effect or not. And right now, metering is turned on because they're white instead of like a little line through them in orange or whatever. But they're not active, because if they were active, it would be a powder blue. And each runway can go active at a different time based on hitting a threshold of time in queue. And this green just showing that the ramp is currently open. So in here is, we have to be in that TM Actions panel that I mentioned, and then these are all the sections under the TM Actions panel. So the first thing we look at is under APREC schedule, and lo and behold, LaGuardia APREC is in there, and it's in effect, and it came in all day. So along the way, we put in the source of where it came from. Some might say TFM flow, some might say from the OIS page, and some might say from the user itself. So in this case, what I learned from this is that the tower TMC waited till the OIS entry came in. Sometimes they won't, since the APREC doesn't show up in a timely manner. As a matter of fact, I'll be to the CDM CAT team out, and I'll be briefing them out in Albuquerque a little bit more about what we're able to get out of the NTML log and what's working timely and what isn't, and things like that. So anyway, they waited till the entry was scraped in out of the from the NTML through the OIS page. And then, if they do like what I mentioned earlier, is if they don't want to, they can just type it on their own or whatever the other restriction is, and enter the start and stop times. And that's how they enter their runway utilization, mile and trail restrictions. Mile and trail restrictions, for the most part, some of these other ones, especially mile and trail, I think they're pretty good at coming through. Ground stop, pretty good at coming through pretty much right away, I believe. And once again, this is what it looks like up in that, the tab along the top. That, I'll tell you my times wouldn't be exactly, what is happening? I keep hitting the wrong button. The tab across the top, the notifications panel would show that LaGuardia is on APREC, and then also the word APREC would show up next to all the LaGuardias on the timeline itself, so they knew they were in APREC. And this is that mode I was telling you about, where it's in semi-automatic mode. If that was filled in, it would be automatic mode. So the TMC just kind of knows that right away. Okay, now I'm APREC and LaGuardia. And this, I'm back at the center right now, and this is the IDAC portion of what the center has set up. And you see the 5 other towers besides Charlotte up underneath Washington Center that have the IDST piece of equipment, where they can set them, the center can set them on the automatic, semi-automatic, or call for release modes. And they could set them all individually. And then, of course, they set up the mile and trail. And by the way, they use 20 mile and trail for LaGuardia when TRACON's asking for 15, because they get compression. So to hold on to that 15 when they're finally down at the 10,000 feet crossing into the TRACON for the compression, they're shooting for a 20-mile gap between each aircraft along the way. So they'll have it set up for 20 mile and trail. And with the ATD-2 system, we were able to add Charlotte onto their existing 5 IDAC IDST, and basically ATD-2 is just acting like a IDST, which is part of the tower portion of the IDAC. And that's how we tied it to Washington Center. Okay, so the day's progressing, and it's not good for LaGuardia. We're found out N90's telling Washington Center that they're holding for LaGuardia, and it's due to weather. So a little bit of weather comes in, and now Washington Center's holding. Okay, so let's see what that looks like. So here they start spinning up here by that boundary where that arc was going to be, right? So they're shut off right there. And just picture these flows as a slinky, where all of a sudden we're all stretched out nice and pretty, and now the front end starts hitting the ground, so it starts all compressing in. And now, might not even be very long at all that, might not be very long at all that TRACON says, okay, you know, it's just a short-term thing, and we can take them on. But as all these compress together, you know, this Linky effect, as all these compress together, it takes a while to get everybody back out of hold again, okay? You can see where we are down by Richmond, a Beam Dulles area. So there's a few different holding pattern areas. They haven't made it to holding at Richmond just yet. So based on that, the TMC got to keep an eye on this at Washington Center and evaluate what they're going to do next. Say, hey, we have a lot of volume, and may have heard that you know, there's some weather out there, so it's not looking good. We have too much volume. We're not going to let any more internal, which does not include Charlotte, because Charlotte is not underneath Washington Center. We're not going to let the internal Washington Center aircraft depart to LaGuardia. We'll put them in the ground stop. So you can see what time of day it is. Put them in the ground stop, okay? That goes through the NTML log, so other folks are aware of this. Command Center especially is aware of it, and the airlines, you know, especially as we get into SWIM and the data sharing, that they're aware of it as well. And here we go. We're more so full. Oh yeah, we're spinning down by Richmond now, and this flow's hitting, and I'm hoping that we're coming out of hold up here, but we are starting to hold down by Richmond as well. So they probably did a good move by internal ground stop till they get things going again. So up here, we started clearing up. New York TRACON started taking the aircraft again. So we're coming out of holding, abeam the Washington Metros, but we still have a mess down here by Richmond trying to catch up out of hold. So let's see what's happening here. Yep, we're still recovering down here by the Richmond area as more flights, overhead flights. Remember, here's Charlotte down here. The overhead's coming from Atlanta. Here's the overhead flow coming from Jacksonville. Here's the overhead flow coming from Indy, just like I showed you earlier on that map. They're all still coming. You know, we didn't know Atlanta or Washington Center didn't shut off the other centers. So they're still going to figure out. They're still internally ground stopped. So now what happens if Charlotte calls, you know, 60 miles beyond the boundary down here, and calls for a release, or maybe doesn't call for a release, is using the IDAC in semi-automatic mode is what we saw. And this is why when I was first interacting with Charlotte, while we teach them along the way, is that even though there's red space, green space, they may not always get the green space. They may not always get it. And here is a perfect situation where they're not going to get that green space. Because of that holding going on, that TMC is going to hedge the bet and say, I can't let them go. It's going to pop up, Charlotte's going to pop up on their timeline, but it's going to maybe drag them back a little bit further, guessing on when the holding's going to finish and when Charlotte would be able to depart and not end up in that holding anyway. So in this case, maybe if they requested a release time right here, which they haven't yet, but if they requested a release time right here, maybe the center would end up giving them a time back here someplace, something like that. Or they may just call and have a discussion with Charlotte and say, here's the situation. Or they may just change the mode back to call for release so they can have that discussion with them rather than just letting them do it automated. And now its situation hasn't improved, apparently, because they did a further ground stop outside of Washington Center. And you can see all the centers included. And this was something that Command Center probably would have put out in place because of thunderstorms along the way. And this would, of course, include down in Charlotte. This would be overhead Charlotte. So right away into the ATD-2 system, it comes in right away, and it would tell the TMC, hey, you're ground stopped to Charlotte. And the other thing that's happening too, and I'm not really showing it to you at the end, but the other thing that's happening too is right away at the ramp, they're seeing that the LaGuardias are ground stop also, immediately. Right away, now that we're hooked up to electronic flight progress ships, and it will be under TFDM, the controllers are seeing that there's a ground stop to LaGuardia. So everybody's getting that message right away, right away. So the really nice thing about that anymore is, especially at a congested airport, space limited airport at Charlotte, is that all those 4 ramp controllers sitting there at Charlotte, boom, LaGuardia's turned red on them, on their data blocks. They go, okay, sir, you know, pushback's not approved now, or whatever their phraseology is, we're ground stop to LaGuardia. That's simple. So it saves them from having planes get out there in their way on the ramp, that congested ramp. Certainly saves planes from getting in the way elsewhere. So everybody's getting that information right away. And as an ex-TMU person for years, I mean, this to me, this type of information that passes along instantaneously like this is huge, where over time you'd have to keep calling people and you're constantly on the phone, and it was like a practical joke almost, because it was like somewhere along the line, I'm not going to get the message to somebody and something's going to fall through the cracks somewhere along the line, because you had to call and keep in touch with so many people about various information, especially when the weather's really building. So this to me is a really big thing, how all this information is getting passed right away to that ramp, because a phone call definitely would have had to be in place otherwise. So let's see what's happening now. Coming out of hold at the Richmond area, so that's good. So we're clearing back up. So we're recovering, and everything's starting to head in the right direction again. Yep, they're doing their last little zigzags, trying to get keep that 20-mile trail. So for that compression, it ends up 15-mile trail. And in the interim, it's been decided that the ground delay program is needed for LaGuardia, because, you know, we're already, if you fall behind a little bit at LaGuardia, it's hard to recover. So with the thunderstorms out there and everything else, we ended up doing a command center in conjunction with the centers and the airlines that put out a ground delay program and canceled the ground stop. So that's what would show up right away on the flight progress trip. Now they have an edict time. The letters GS isn't there anymore. We try to remind them best we can, hey, try to schedule within that 10-minute EDCT window if you can. We also know in the end, if there's an APREC and an edict, that the APREC ends up overriding the edict. For right or for wrong, that's what happens, and they go with the APREC time. But it looks, in this particular case, since we're all green and we came out of hold at Washington Center, it's probably going to be able to get a time that's going to hit both in this case. Now, oh boy, looks like there's weather back at the south end of Washington Center, where the flow comes out of Charlotte and heads up to the northeast. So looks like Washington Center is deciding to ground stop Kilns and put a mile and trail on Barmy, you know, just like more or less making it as one flow situation because of the deviation coming out. It also helps them with volume dealing with the sun. So that's that's how Washington Center would convey that to Atlanta. They would enter it into the logs. They include Atlanta Center in that knowledge, and Atlanta Center can break it to Charlotte, or sometimes Atlanta Center will just say you can let Charlotte know at the same time. But Atlanta Center needs to be in the loop. Same with the APREC too. Atlanta Center's in the loop because Atlanta Center is the one's going to get questions asked to them about anything about Charlotte. And it only shows 10s. Like I said, I don't have all my pictures matching up the mile and trail. And there's one of those qualifiers I was telling you about that's an as one. So in that case, they want Kilns Barmy as one. So the picture here is showing the mile and trail next to the Barmies, showing the mile and trail next to the Barmies. And I believe it was mentioned in the last briefing in this room, but we don't, at Charlotte, we don't space the aircraft out for that 15-mile trail behind the scenes on the surface system, if it's 10 or 15-mile trail. This is more of an awareness for everyone that there's a 15-mile trail. By the way, this mile trail is also going to show up on the ramps data tag, and it's also going to show up on the flight progress strips, electronic flight progress strips, so the controllers know right away. By the way, this is a call for release symbol there for Philly. Let's see. Okay, so here's some of the ramp data tags and what they're seeing. I probably should have intertwined this a little bit better, but the ramp data tags, you know, if the APREC was already timed, so they know they haven't, that ramp controller just sees this and says, oh, okay, he's already got his APREC time. When United 1087 calls for pushback, yep, pushback approved. And because they see he's already got an APREC time. If the word here just said APREC, they would say, no, it can't push back yet. You need to call clearance delivery to get your release time. So they would know that right away. This is all, kind of being done non-verbally. Here's a mile on trail that happened to be in place over Barmy. In this case, it's 20. And this is showing them, this is great stuff here. This is showing that Kilns is closed. And if that turns red, like when Washington Center put that entry in, it said Kilns is closed, boom, it turns red for them right away. So this is telling that ramp controller, oh, JetBlue, no, sorry, can't push back. We don't have a route for you at this time. If it gets coordinated that, after the ground stop takes place for Kilns, if it gets coordinated that, okay, we do have a route for you, and maybe it is over Barmy or whatever the case is, then the TMC in the Charlotte Tower could put that in from a to be determined to a new fix. So what we do then is we show Kilns in yellow. So that ramp TMC knows that Kilns is still closed, but hey, you can call clearance delivery because there is a reroute form, okay? Just simple color coding, no phone calls required. In this one, it's great because you're not having all these pilots bug that clearance delivery person who's pretty busy making reroutes because they know there's no route available. We already told them that answer right there. And now there is, go ahead and call them. When the ramp controller sees this change to something else that's not color coded, he doesn't care what fix it is. As long as it's not lit up like this, then he knows that pilot had called clearance delivery and got the new reroute. And that's what both an EDCT and an APREC would look like. Runway change, the tower can request, the ramp tower can request runway change. And there's, in our case, it would have been LaGuardia earlier, but there's what a ground stop would look like. Same type of scenario for the ramp to know right away. And then there's aircraft with EDCT only. We're doing a time. Good. And this is what I was telling you about earlier, that the ramp would definitely take advantage of this notifications panel that was in the tower TMC's top panel. The ramp is looking at this quite a bit, and so they know exactly what's happening, who's coming in and out of APREC, where the miles and trail are and stuff like that. So they're aware, once again, as soon as that tower TMC is aware, they're aware of, did I do that? Hope not. They're aware as soon as I'm aware, or as soon as the tower TMC is aware of what restrictions are in place. And this is where we were mentioning how it's going over to the electronic flight progress strips right away. We just started this back in September, October timeframe, I believe, where we picked 5 items to send from ATD-2 right to the electronic flight progress strips. And they are the APREC time. So once again, the APREC time, as soon as Washington Center approves that time in their EDCT or EDC TBFM, it shoots right over to the TMC, it shoots right over to the controller, and it shoots right to the ramp. So all 3 folks know right away what that release time is. Okay, where before just last September, that tower TMC had to manually retype that in. Once they got it, once it came over to STBO, they'd sit there and retype it in. So another thing that's just getting sent out that we don't have to type in, we don't have to verbally coordinate, things like that. The other components are the operational necessity runway. If they need the longer runway, the center runway, the ramp can request that non-verbally, and they're going to be able to do that, I believe, under TFDM in the future through TFMS. They'll make the request through TFMS. Once again, how the 3 T's are tying together. And from there, it'll show up on that strip of why they're heading to that particular runway because of operational necessity. I mentioned APREC. Swaps and stops will also show up in there. So that ground stop to LaGuardia, boom, would have come right across to the strips as well. By the way, for the command center folks, I know as a TMC over the years, we in the TMUs kind of got it that right up to the bitter last minute, when the ground stop was about ready to run out, 2200 or whatever the case was, that there might still be discussion with the airlines and the facilities about, well, should we come out of this ground stop or not? And sometimes it would run beyond the end time. So think about it now. In the future, it's going to be really important to make sure you put an update out there, or right away, if it hits, right beyond 2000 Zulu or whenever the stop time was, that the ground stop's going to go away on the strips, it's going to go away in the ramp, and everybody's going to think, okay, it's over, let's start moving them, you know. So everybody will have to be more timely because more and more people are getting that information right away, the start stops, et cetera. Okay. And that is the main part of the briefing, and there's certainly all sorts of various TMIs that can go on. So in other aspects, and that was just kind of the one scenario, heading things back and how we ended up with STBO. Part 2, which will be tomorrow in this room, I'll have Brian with me, and he'll talk more about the, you know, what was able to be ingested without the tower TMCs entering it manually, and just the good points, bad points about it coming out of the OIS page from the NTML, or it coming from TFM flow, things like that. So we'll discuss that a little bit more tomorrow, and I'm going to get on my soapbox tomorrow and discuss the TMI that's used most often, and that is, of course, APREX. We'll talk about that, and then Brian will talk about some TTP data as well, TFDM terminal publication data as well. That'll be part 2, but for now, anybody have any questions? Go ahead.
Two questions, actually. You mentioned when the stop ended and how it would go away. Where does it pull that information from? Is it on the automatic stop at the end of the update time, or does it pull when FSM sends out a cancellation message? Does it pull it from there? And the reason why I ask that is because inside the ground delay program, if command center puts out a stop and then doesn't revise the ground delay program, there's not a cancellation that comes through FMS that command center would have to send out a manual advisor. Would that be reflected on that automated strip?
I believe it would be. I don't see.
I think there might be an unfortunate chronology confusion with the stop here. I mean, the stop shown there is actually a part of the stop that's in the place of its closure as opposed to the ground stop.
Well, I think I was mainly referring to the example of the LaGuardia stop, which in that case was an airline specific, but at the end of an actual ground stop, if the ground stop isn't canceled out of that or out of the flight monitoring, the schedule monitoring system, so it just automatically ends at the end time.
We're basically looking for a flight that falls in the middle of the program time. That's the problem.
Yeah, I've never seen anything where that situation's come up, so it must just end otherwise.
Command center will often have to send out just a manual advisor, which would not be part of the instant roundout.
Okay, so we must be picking that up then otherwise. Yeah.
And then the other question that I had was, in your example, you had the NTML message that it was an airline specific.
Yeah, that was just kind of, yeah.
Well, it brought up a question that I had was, if they do an airline specific initiative, are they pulling from the FMS that data? And does it reflect on those data tags if it's a Delta only or American only or something like that?
I don't think we absolutely can pull that part out, but we did give the tower TMC the inclusions and exclusions function. So we specifically added exclusions so we could exclude everybody else except this flight, right, or include whatever the case is. Yep. Anybody else?
Yeah, one question, Bob. You mentioned 3Ps, and one of the original problems we always had with FSM, and that is that the mileage trails and the minutes don't really translate into the demand predictions within the CFNS. And I'm curious if the ATD-2 environment changes that a lot or slightly or really not at all in terms of the data that goes out of ATD-2 into CFNS.
I don't think currently it changes it other than, Maybe in phase 3, there might be a chance of that because they are calculating the miles and trail out. So it potentially could calculate that because it's got to calculate at least to offer departure toss routes. But as far as down the line on this set of airplanes, I'm not really sure if that would change it right now. Is there any questions from internet?
Not on the other.
Okay. Anybody else?
I just had one question, at least I knew I had early on doing this program, was we were talking about the EOBT. I know there's earliest off block and estimated off block. I don't know if the interest of the folks in the room to explain the difference in which one we're using.
Well, we're using the earliest off block time to calculate when an APREC is in place. That's what we're using, is the earliest off block time to calculate the APREC itself. And then as the actual off block time takes place, heading down the line, then we're obviously updating it from there, and we give that TMC a heads up. I don't think we have an indication of one here, but we would give that TMC, if this already had a time, we would block that time in color coding. We'd say green if he was right on time within the APREC window, red if he was behind the window, and it's like a mustard brown if he was ahead of time. Oh, yep, there's one over here. It's probably at the bottom of the timeline. So this is showing red that he's a little bit late getting to the APREC window, so you're trying to remind the TMC, hey, you probably need to request a new release time here, that type of scenario. So it switches from one to the other. I'm not sure if that answers your question or not. Okay. Any other questions? Again, we can talk more tomorrow about how the data ends up in the system itself, how it's been adjusted tomorrow as well. Are we well? Okay. Well, if there's no further questions, guess we'll go ahead and terminate. Thank you.